My other example is a political speech, and again here, what we were discussing yesterday and today as well. So if you have translations of speeches, or if journalists give quotes of speeches or refer to speeches which were originally delivered in another language, so the normal reader of the newspaper does not go and say, well, I now need to find the original and compare what the journalist told me is really correct, because normally you don't know the other language. But also politicians react to statements by other politicians which were given to them in the form of translations. And the example I want to use here is the speech by the Iranian President Ahmadinejad, with this reference to Israel to be wiped off the map. So a quote which has been referred to intertextuality again and again. And you see here politicians react to statements made by others. So Tony Blair here quoted by BBC, the news BBC, that he had expressed revulsion at the president's assertion that he wanted Israel wiped off the map. So wiped off the map is the quote which the Iranian president used. So there is not only one translation of the speech by Ahmadinejad, but there are several translations into English, and on the handout you have the wider context for a number of these translations which I found on the web. And it's not in each case that this particular phrase here has been translated or rendered into English as wipe off the map. So what you have on the handout is the reference where all these translations were found, who these translations had done, or who had commissioned the translations. And then I have given these particular, just these minor extracts where this reference to this wipe off the map appears. But it's interesting then to see also if there are different translations, so which of these do politicians use to comment on and to react to, or quote again and again and again. So this was a speech given in October 2005 at a conference, and we might want to practice again our audience design. Yeah, so who were the HSCs, who were the auditors here? So a speech delivered in Farsi. Questions of interest for translation studies would also be then into which languages was the speech translated, not only English but other languages as well. Where was it translated? Was it translated within Iran and then the translation sent abroad, or was it translated outside Iran and kind of imported? And then how were these texts, these translations used? Recontextualization, published where, republished where, reacted to. So Al Jazeera had the reference here, Israel must be wiped off the map. So at first there's this reference to an earlier speech, argument by Khomeini, and then referring to the current situation in Palestine as well. And you also see here with Al Jazeera, you have information in brackets. Yeah? So Ahmadinejad did not speak with using bits in brackets, but you see here it's a kind of intervention or explicitation, or the translator or an editor, don't know, had found it necessary to clarify certain references. So this disgraceful plot was then specified as saying, well, this refers to Israel. Soon wipe off. So the wipe off comes twice. New York Times. And again, if you look at the handout, so the way it was contextualized here, there was a short text before the speech saying the text was posted online, but here you have a translation which was done by the Islamic Student Association, so not saying this is a text or the translation was done by New York Times, but referring to a text as done by somebody else. And then it also says the text of the speech was posted online in Persian by the Rain Student News Agency. Bracketed explanatory material is from the translator. So also here you have some information which was added not in this particular bit here, but in some other parts of the speech. Wiped off the map, eliminate this disgraceful stain from the world. Yeah? So you see different formulation here. MEMRI is the Middle East Media Research Institute. They also refer to saying the Iranian news agency ISNA published the full text of the speech. The following is a translation of excerpts from the speech. But also what I found, another website which referred to ISNA, which you have on the handout, which my next one is, it's not exactly the same as what they claim where it comes from. Yeah? So some more recontextualization or editing work has gone on. Eliminated from the pages of history. Second case, the stain of disgrace. Yeah? So also with the in brackets you have the explanation. Will be purged from the center of the Islamic world. So different solution here. This is the Iranian news agency which is referred to. Wiped off the face of the earth, wipe this scourge of shame from the Islamic world. So you have different translations of what we see here. The president's own website doesn't have the whole speech in English. At least several times when I checked, it was only giving me a kind of brief summary of what it was. But in this summary, they actually use wipe Israel away. Yeah? But in the title, it says Ahmadinejad supporters of Israel will face wrath of Islamic Ummah. Yeah? So wipe Israel away. So the wipe is there. So you can argue, so all the texts are in the public domain. And there were several articles also published later who referred to this was a mistake, a mistranslation, this was wrongly translated. And there was a reference to another article in the New York Times saying they reopened this issue of his notorious appeal. So you have an evaluation here as well, notorious appeal to wipe Israel off the map. The Times piece focuses exclusively on the translation or possible mistranslation of the statement. I think what is interesting, I don't know Farsi, I can't look at it and say, well, this one is correct or incorrect. But I think what's more interesting, also for translation studies, is which of these different translations is the one which gets cited again and again. Why are some translations more powerful than others? Why do politicians, if they reuse it or recontextualize it, use one translation? And why are they not then going back to some of the others? I mean, the first one also with the one which Tony Blair referred to, this was the translation done by the BBC, the BBC Monitoring Service. So BBC Monitoring Service has among its clients the British government. So it was quite clear that they got their translation from somewhere. And once they had it, and they reacted to this, they didn't see any need then to go back and look at some other translations or wait for other translations before they reacted to one of those. And also if you look at some other texts, have some interviews which were conducted by English, also German journalists interviewing the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Iran or interviewing other ministers from Middle Eastern countries. And whenever they referred or want to get some kind of statement about what do you think of Ahmadinejad, what do you think of the Iran's intention, it's always using this wipe Israel off the map again. So there is one phrase which has become established, or which has survived. And I think this is nothing where you would say the linguistic analysis or even a text linguistic analysis will be sufficient to explain it, but that's a question of power. Why would certain politicians prefer or rely on translations done by particular institutions, translation companies, and not others? And it's also linked to the question of trust, which you mentioned yesterday in your talk. So, when all these kind of our traditional or the old-fashioned views of translation is just transferring meaning, and the source text needs to be reproduced faithfully, and the original is the most important one, and the target text is equivalent, and there's either literal or dual translation, and if we don't stick to the truth of the source text, then we have lost something. This is not really very helpful if we see that texts are used in the domain of politics to get political ideas across, to interact with statements by other politicians. Because these texts exist. So I think it's much more interesting than for us to look at the institutional context in which texts are produced and how politicians interact with these texts and how journalists use translations or decide to quote which extracts to get particular political opinions in the public domain. There was an article in the journal. Oh yeah. Before I come to this one, there's also this more traditional idea that you need to be faithful to the source text is also something which politicians seem to hold, because at the end of one interpreted press conference in Germany at the G8 summit in 2007, it was shown on BBC News, so that when Bush had finished his talk and then the interpreter had finished his consecutive rendering, then Bush turned, looking at the German Chancellor, and said, well, is this what I said? So again, trust. Yeah? So it was done more jokingly, what I was saying earlier. So these press conferences, so for Bush, it's the interaction, and I show how I interact with you. But it reflects this idea of, I want to have the exact rendering of my initial words. So modern views, yeah? So translation is embedded in ideological contexts. We need to think about ideological, institutional, conditional constraints as well, in addition to readers, addressees, audience designs, corpus. There was the article in the journal Discourse and Society, which is not a translation studies journal, but it is a journal about discourse analysis. And there was one chapter where two authors had looked at how a particular speech was published in translation in a newspaper. And then their argument was saying, well, what's going on here is not translation, but in the newspaper we see transformation. So the media, when they reproduce text, they have transformations but not translation. But these were people who are not working within translation studies. Because I think we don't need a differentiation like this, because what happens, what we see here also in the case of media reporting about speeches or these interacting with speeches or with the press conferences, it can legitimately be called translation if we understand translation not in this old traditional sense as a faithful reproduction of the source text. Yeah? But what would be interesting, or what I think would be necessary to research more, are these ideological dimensions which have an impact on translation. I just give this quote here by Timoshko and Gensler from the introduction in the book Translation and Power. Yeah? Translation is not simply an act of faithful reproduction, but rather a deliberate, conscious act of selection, assemblage, structuration, fabrication, even in some cases falsification, counterfeiting, and so on. I don't have the examples I looked at. I don't have any kind of deliberate falsification. But definitely there are the conditions and the aims which have an impact on how what the text look like. So the research question I'm asking myself, and for which I would need to do more research in order to be able to provide the answers, are questions like, what influence do the practices in political institutions have on the selection, dissemination, reception of translated political discourse? So, for example, the British government, yeah? So they use translations from BBC monitoring service. So which translations do they commission? What's the interaction there? Or does the BBC monitoring service offer their translation? This might be of interest to you. Why are they using only one agency and not others? Who ask them which of the speeches by Blair or Brown now get translated into other languages? There's now, when Gordon Brown took over, surprise, surprise, the website of the UK government also now has foreign language versions, which didn't happen in the past. Whereas if you look at the website of the German government, the French government, so a number of speeches are made available in translation. Embassies have texts available or speeches available in translation, but not all of them, some of them. And some speeches by the German Chancellor get translated into English but not into French. So what are the processes? Who decides which texts get translated into which language and where are they made available? So what is the translation policy of a political institution is a linked question. Do they have one? Who is translating? Do the governments have their own translation department? Or do they send their text to translation agencies or translation companies? What's going on? So we don't know much about these institutional contexts. So who decides on selection of text? Who produces translations of speeches? All those. I think knowing a bit more about this institutional context and the power of the people in these contexts will add some of the missing links we need then also to relate what we see at the textual surface, what's going on, to institutional practices, institutional policies, and the ideologies reflected in this. I think that's my last slide. Thank you very much.
Thank you.